So, Jeff, if someone's listening to this, wouldn't they say, well, wait a minute, if the situation is so bad and the US economy is so broken and then they face this kind of untenable system, shouldn't bond vigilantes show up and say, hey, it's time to make the US pay their fair share on these bonds? I don't want 5% rates or 4% rates. I want junk bond rates because I'm lending to these guys who are completely profligate. They have no idea what they're doing. They have a broken system, says Jeff Snyder. So why are we not seeing bond vigilantes?
Because everything you just cited is a reason to own safety. And unfortunately, the sad thing is, and this is one of the most perverse aspects of the system, we value safety in government bonds. We see safety in government bonds. And it's not really because of the government's fiscal situation. It's really about liquidity. It's the fact that government bonds have historically the deepest market associated with them, because bonds are treated as, reserves for a whole bunch of reasons, whether they be statutory or just in practice. Government bonds have attained the status of being the safest part of it. And there's legitimate arguments, right? The treasury market is the most liquid market out there. And the way the system works, heavily collateralized, it's really about safety. So just like we saw in the 1930s, I think people miss this point too. All the arguments that were made that are being made today were absolutely made in the 1930s. In fact, Warren Buffett's father made, the same thing. FDR is bankrupting the country with his New Deal spending, which, he did. The treasury market's going to blow up because deficits, before we got to World War II, massive deficits that we'd never seen before. The 30s deficits were larger than the Civil War or World War I. We'd never seen anything like peacetime deficits like those. The federal government's going broke. The country's in the worst depression in its economic history. And what did everybody do with their money? They bought treasuries. The yields on treasuries kept going lower and lower and lower. Banks, financial counterparties, financial participants, nobody wanted to lend in the real economy. Just like in the 2010s, everybody wanted to own what is perceived of as safety. So that's the reason why we don't see bond vigilantes today, is because stuck in this depressionary circumstance, it's depression economics, everybody wants to own safety. And the only people who don't want to own safety just did a bunch of stupid garbage that blew up a huge bubble that's about to blow up in our face. So it's either one or the other, and neither of those are really productive uses, like I said. So bond vigilantism has been buried underneath depression economics ever since 2008. In fact, those two things go together. It was one of the most toughest aspects of the 2008 crisis, because you had, under George Bush, his stupid TARP thing, who basically broke with all previous convention after the 1930s and said, give me as much money as I can borrow, or it's going to be the worst case scenario in human history. He basically blackmailed the country. Give me TARP. Give me all the funds for TARP. And back at the time, it was about $1 trillion. $1 trillion was like, holy crap, this is enormous. Today, it's a drop in the bucket, but that's the reason why. Bush said, give me the money for unlimited money from TARP. A lot of people said, uh-oh, the treasury market's going to explode, dollar's dead. And it was the opposite. Where we should have had bond vigilantism, you only had more and more demand for U.S. treasuries. And then the saddest part of that, the politicians eventually figured this out. They had figured out not necessarily where this was coming from, but they figured out we have a blank check. We can borrow an unlimited amount, and it doesn't seem to matter. There is no bond vigilantism. The reason we have deficits that are out of control is, again, because of depression economics. The politicians realized we can create deficits as far as the sky can see, and somewhere there's demand for all of the debt that we raised in order to pay for that stuff. And that demand comes from the depression economics. So all the stuff you just said, Ben, are actually symptoms of the economy and the system that don't work. And it all goes back to the sad history of prioritizing and looking at government bonds as if they're safe. And it's really about liquidity more than safety. That's really the original sin here. And because of that, we're kind of stuck in this rut where the bigger government gets, the worse the problem it's going to be in the economy. That's a Japanese example to a T. The Japanese did more and more government finance spending. It didn't get them anywhere. It just left them with huge amounts of debt. It didn't blow up the yen. It didn't blow up the currency. It didn't blow up the bond market. It just left the economy to suffer from it. Because for all the stuff that Keynes got wrong, he was right about that. At the end of the day, when you get into these depressionary circumstances, these deflationary circumstances, who really ends up paying for it? Well, the big guys that created the mess, they get bailed out. Who ends up paying for the crappy depression economy that comes afterward? It's always the little guys, always the workers. So the worse it gets for the workers, the more you know this is the reason why it's there. And that's why we don't have bond vigilantism. There's a reason the politicians and governments go crazy. No politician anywhere is going to be able to sit back and say, the economy sucks, which means I need to pull back. because they'll be immediately criticized for their austerity. Voting public will go nuts. There's no political will to actually restrain governments, which would actually help the situation.
Let's see if I can summarize the Jeff Snyder thesis, which is that, hey, this euro dollar system, it started to break down. And when it did break down in 2008, rather than saying, hey, there's all this malinvestment in this euro dollar ecosystem, let's flush out the system, let's try again. It will be painful, but we'll figure it out. We did the classic moral hazard, which is, hey, let's bail everyone out. Let's make things super safe. Of course, the bond vigilantes died because, hey, we have this super safe asset, right? We'll continue to kick the economy along, but not really fix the problem. And now we're in a world where, because the problem doesn't feel like it's fixed, there's this K-shaped economy, this broken economy. People feel like, hey, we got to do something to fix this, but that something continues to destroy or reiterate the problem that we've created before. Is that why, Jeff, you think we've seen gold prices continue to rise? People feel like, hey, I know something's wrong. I don't understand a euro dollar system. The guy Jeff's way too smart for me, but I know there's something about this economy that isn't right. And seeing the stock market at all-time highs doesn't actually fill me with confidence. It fills me with confusion. And so I want to buy an asset that I know is outside of this whole financial engineering system. Is that why you see gold prices rising in your view?
Yeah, Ben, I think that's probably the best explanation I've ever heard for what's going on with gold here. And you could see it started right at the end of the 2010s. Gold prices started to rise in 2018, 2019 when people started. You're right. They don't know anything about the Eurodollar system. They couldn't care less about it. And really, you can understand where that's coming from. What they know is this isn't working. This isn't working, and it continues to go on longer and longer and longer. I don't know what the real problem is, but I know this is whatever I keep hearing, it's not it. The more they say the economy's booming, the more they say the stock market is representing the booming economy, the more I know it's just complete crap. And so what do I want to do? Where do I go to protect myself? This is the reason why gold is, the age-old, the rock that you want to depend upon in any big storm, is because I think people are extrapolating ahead, and reasonably so, and thinking, okay, the system doesn't work. All the other financial assets are obscenely valued, or at least, not anchored to anything. If we keep going in this direction, and there is nothing to suggest that we won't go in this direction, what's that going to do? It's going to eventually lead to what we should have done in 2008, but even more violent. Like you said, Ben, 2008, we should have taken our medicine. It would have been bad. It would have been really bad. It would have been harmful and ugly and disastrous and any bad words you can throw out there. It would have been a catastrophe. But it would have been much better to get it done in 2009 than to be talking about it in 2029. Because in 2029, if we have to do that again and a solution doesn't arise from the bottom up and just take over like the Eurodollar did in 1960, if this continues to go in the same direction, we don't have a solution for it, it'll be 10 times as messy, because then we're not just talking about some banks failing and some people losing their money. Then we're talking about entire systems that are going to be redrawn, and maybe redrawn by some people. We don't want to redraw the system. So that's where gold is coming from. Gold is like, hey, we don't like where this is going, and nothing suggests it's going to change. We got to have something available that at least, if it does get to be that bad, we have some stability that bridges the divide from A to B. And when we see gold prices continue to rise, what that says is more and more people agree with you. You might have started out pretty lonely in 2018. Not many people were talking about gold then. It was pretty low. But nowadays, it's like, hey, everybody in China, the Chinese are saying the same. Why are they buying gold? Because it keeps getting worse and worse, and nobody provides any answer. Emerging markets, like I said before, it seems like in 2008, they just flipped off the positive future that everybody thought was coming. Nothing has changed there. Gold is at the end of every one of these questions. If you don't really know what the question is or what the answer is, that's where gold comes from. And that's exactly what the demand for it is. And like I said, the higher gold goes, the more people agree with that. The portfolio that performs in one economic regime can get crushed in the next. So in this free webinar, we're going to reveal what those 4 economic regimes are, how to identify them, as well as the assets, historically speaking, best positioned to perform in every environment. So reserve your seat now and learn how to prepare your portfolio before the economy shifts again.